Good morning and welcome to our webinar on cybersecurity. Of course, we are in COVID times, so normally we would be either face-to-face in our Deloitte house, or I will be in the studio with my colleagues. But today, I think we are going to do this fully virtually and from my work office at my house as well. So a warm welcome to all of you. Today we will talk briefly about our cybersecurity survey in 2020, and then I will move on to a couple of related topics which I think are relevant for this audience. A little bit about myself. My name is Sedar Kabuk, as your host and presenter today. Close to 20 years in this area and having seen it through an initial level of maturity to where we are today, which is, I think, right at the center of our issues that are related to businesses in Denmark and also in the region. I'm a partner in Deloitte. I lead our Nordic and Denmark cybersecurity practices, mostly coming from a financial services background, primarily worked in the UK in the past, but have been working in the Nordics region for over 10 years now. Next slide, please. So we will have a brief look at basically the outcome from our survey, which I think is going to be a good way to test our maturity in the Danish landscape in terms of cybersecurity. But I don't want to leave it just like that. I want to go through a couple of other areas. Firstly, a real life example of how it feels to be subjected to a cyber attack. And these are the real life examples that we would like to go through and talk about what went well, what didn't go so well. And finally, conclude our session with a discussion on what we can do about it. Now, I will try to leave some time for questions. I hope you will find it interesting to ask some follow-up questions. If not, I also have some questions that you can ask to your executives in the coming months as you talk about cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So what we've done is every year we are looking at the lay of the cyber landscape for Denmark. And if you move to the next slide, you will see that this year we've extended it to all industries. So we are covering 4 industries, close to 300 organizations from public sector to financial services to consumer goods and energy. And this is our way of showing how we are actually doing and getting the temperature from the Danish landscape. Our questions were run by an intermediate company. So my image froze there. I'm trying to see if this is working well. And we are basically looking at the responses from these 4 sectors, but also looking at the differences and similarities between each of these areas. I'll just pause here before I move to the next slide. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So the first question we've asked our customers and organizations in these 4 sectors is whether we are able to find and keep our cybersecurity talents. As Deloitte, of course, we are in competition with some of our clients in this area, and we see that sometimes it is hard to find the technical resources and technical people to work on the interesting projects that we have. And when we look at the sector, actually, we saw that the answer is rather mixed. And we saw that when you look at the general cybersecurity landscape, when there are generic resources required, the companies are finding it easy to attract people, especially in financial services, where there is potentially some salary element to it as well. And also for interesting jobs that they can do, it seems like the companies that we've talked to find it okay to attract talent. When it comes to technical areas, this seems to be a more problematic, especially when you look at both financial services, but also energy. When we talk to our clients and organizations, we see that it is difficult to find these more technical, skilled people, but also keep them. And interesting differences also when we looked at the response from the public sector to the remaining and compare it to the other industries, we saw that it is the public sector organizations find it a bit easier to retain talents compared to other industries. And this might be a good indication that the new generation of cybersecurity professionals are a little bit more interested in the purpose of what they're doing, and they're a bit more interested in the value that they are getting to the society rather than just a matter of a career decision or personal interest, which was interesting to see. So my message to all of you listening is it is definitely important for our cybersecurity talent nowadays to define the purpose and the value of what they do, and also build it into the job, even descriptions and job specifications when they are looking for these people. When it comes to technical people, we saw also a lot of skills imported into the region, and that is also what we're doing at Deloitte. Next slide. We are expecting this to increase. We're expecting the cybersecurity talent to become more contentious. As I said, our initial hypothesis was that it was difficult to find these skills, and we've concluded that it is actually a mix. So the first area of general cybersecurity professionals, people find it a bit easier to find. When it comes to more technical skills, we find it a bit more difficult. But the trend, unfortunately, in cybersecurity is moving towards more technically apt area. So as we talk more about OT security, IoT security, cloud security, these things will unfortunately restrict the job pool that we have. So that means we need to spend a bit, even more time and effort on training our people, even we actually get them on board as generalists. Next slide, please. Now, compared to that, when we looked at the question of whether the cybersecurity threats have increased in the region, we actually got a more uniform answer across all sectors. We asked the question whether they have seen an increase in the last 2-3 years, and they have seen an increase in the last 6 to 8 months with COVID-19 situation, and the answer was pretty similar. They have the majority of the organizations have seen an interest or increase in the cybersecurity threat landscape. Now, what this has done is this definitely has put cybersecurity in the center of the attention circle. It has increased the attention of the executives. It has increased the attention of the media, who used to look at cybersecurity as more of a niche area. It has increased the attention of the businesses who are interested in not being one of those who are reported as being hit as by an incident, or those who are not able to respond to it. So this has given us, as the industry, a great platform that we can use and make use of all this attention. And we'll talk about whether this attention has become to a reality. But what I would also say is it is sometimes a limited attention span. We see, and this is more possibly related to individual organizations. We typically see a spike of interest, especially in the board and the C-level executives, but that doesn't live too long. 3 to 6 months later, we see that attention to disappear. So you all have a short window of opportunity to make the best use of that attention. Of course, as things happen, it comes back, but I wouldn't say that we will actually have a constant attention of cybersecurity all the time. So our advice is to make the best use of it while you have it especially in the senior leadership. Next slide, please. And then we looked at what did that attention do. And we looked at two things. And the first thing is whether we were able to build cyber resiliency into what we do. And we looked at 5 areas specifically. When you look at whether organizations are able to build in resiliency into their data security propositions, the answer was yes. There were a high number of organizations who were able to deal with the data aspects of security and privacy. And of course, this is heavily also driven by the GDPR regulation 3 years ago, 2 years ago, that pushed these organizations to deal with data security matters in a bit more, a bit more urgency. The second area that actually scored well in this is cloud. And this is a bit surprising. And I believe that this is heavily driven by some of the promises that we are getting from our cloud service providers. So when organizations move to cloud, whether that's Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, we see these cloud service providers offering a lot of inbuilt security, which is actually a positive thing. But what is maybe not so positive is there are degrees of the security when you actually buy a cloud package. And people often don't realize that some of the good security measures are usually sold as extra, or they are actually coming with a more premium package. And maybe we're not able to make that distinction when we move to cloud. The second thing I would also say is moving to cloud intrinsically gives you the ability to say, actually, I've now outsourced my security. Same thing with outsourcing. And that is not entirely true. When you look at outsourcing, obviously you can only outsource part of your security, including accountability, and some of the retained responsibility remains with the organization itself. So I would say when you look at cloud, we typically advise our clients as Deloitte to look at the operating model very carefully and not think that you're outsourcing security by doing that. The last 3 areas that didn't really score well are the new technology, especially when people into new technology and marketing and building IoT type environments. And this is a bit worrying because this shows that security is not built into these new technologies and new business ideas that are actually now coming to pass. And what we typically say is, what's today's new technology will be tomorrow's legacy. So if you don't deal with today's technology and build the right security measures in them, tomorrow you will have a legacy problem, which will be lacking security, which was the case when we looked at mainframes 15, 20 years ago. What we call legacy today were new technology at that time, and now we're talking about legacy vulnerabilities, which is an issue. Next slide, please. And the trend is, of course, moving towards new technology. And as we are looking at digitization and new technologies and cloud, we are looking to see an increasing trend of, unfortunately, security not being built into these, and security being still dealt with the traditional sense of let's secure the network, let's secure the core infrastructure, but not necessarily built into these new technologies as a secure by design principle or privacy by design principle. So unfortunately, the trend is a little bit against us when it comes to this statistic. Next slide, please. Now, this is interesting. We did almost a self-assessment as part of our survey of the 300 organizations, and we asked the question, how they rate when it comes to their self-security capability. And it looks like we are actually getting an average of a score of 6 to 7 out of 0 to 10, 0 being no maturity and 10 being the ideal, not the ideal, but the ultimate secure environment. And again, I think this is a little bit higher than what we expected. And I will show you in the next slide, but not yet, that actually the reality may not be as bright. But when we look at our self-evaluation, I fear that we are a little bit too optimistic when it comes to our own capability of security. And I'll give you one example. When we asked this question to financial services, they actually rated themselves lower than the other industries. And this kind of defies logic, because financial services, as we know and as we experience, is a slightly more mature environment for security, given that they've been dealing with fraud and they've been dealing with customer fraud and all sorts of direct financial impact elements of security. Now, but them scoring themselves lower than others, for me, actually shows a bit more awareness of security, rather than this being a gut feeling and this being rather a positive outlook that maybe not be the real case here. And if you also look at other industries like consumer and public sector, there's a big variation of the scores, meaning that some people have scored themselves really well, some people haven't. That kind of, again, shows maybe a bit more, I don't want to say guesstimate, but a bit more feeling-based scoring, whereas for financial services, the scores were a bit more consistent across different organizations. Now, I wish, of course, that this perception was true, but if you go to the next slide, you will see that despite a good score of 6 and 7s, which means you're closer to the ideal case, we don't expect anyone to be 9s or 10s, to be honest. If you just want to do a cost and benefit analysis, that may not be the level. If you look at 6 and 7s, and then you look at the question that we're asking here, whether you implemented some baseline security measures, they don't actually correlate well. Here we are focusing on 4 areas that we asked, where the companies have a plan for how they want to defend themselves, which could be the network, the infrastructure, whether they have trained their staff in terms of the threats, but also what they should be doing in the event of a crisis, whether they have the basic cyber hygiene implemented, which usually means have you fixed your vulnerabilities, and whether you have a response plan. And when when the worst thing happens, whether that's a digital pandemic or a sort of immersed-like situation where you get disruption, whether we have a plan or whether we have tested. And unfortunately, when you look at the scores here, we would expect if you are a 7, you would probably need to have all of these ticked in your box, because these are for us sort of a base scenario before you move up the stack and talk about some more interesting stuff like application security or IoT security. These are the bread and butter that we would expect all organizations to have some element. And unfortunately, as I said, we are seeing some low scores here, especially when it comes to awareness and response, which is interesting to see. Next slide, please. And again, with the evolving threat landscape, we are expecting to build security on these 4 principles. And of course, it will only mean that you need to do a bit more depending on what type of company you are, what type of organization, and what type of threats you are dealing with. But the first thing that we typically say is know your enemy, or know yourself as well. So know your enemy, meaning that who has an interest in you, who has the motivation to attack your company and your organization. What is the motivation? Is it financial? Is it reputation? Is it disgruntled employees? Have you gone through a major change that maybe some of your employees are very unhappy and they may have some issues, or they may have accidents, or do you have state secrets, or do you have the next COVID-19 vaccine intellectual capital that might be interested for a nation state? So know your enemy, and then know yourself, meaning that what do you have that you pretty much want to protect with your with everything that you've got. What do you have that you will not tolerate losing in terms of critical assets, in terms of critical data? What is actually that is important to you? You know, for example, if I take an analogy of a fire scenario, in military, you have things labeled as first thing to save in fire, second thing to save in fire, and then these things maybe you don't care so much about. And they have all color codings of that. So you would get a desk with a color code on it to say this is the first thing that I want to save in the event of fire. Do you have something like that for security scenarios? Is what we're talking about. So that's what we're seeing in the Danish landscape. If I have to summarize, the situation is that we've come a long way of recognizing that this is a problem. We've come a long way in getting the attention of our executives. We've come a good way to understand that we should do something about it. And we are somewhat on a improvement required. And yes, we are doing a good job in terms of the execution part. And now what I feel like the Danish landscape, Danish organizations need is more execution and more decisiveness and more leadership to get these matters. Once we identify the problem, let's stop talking about the problem and let's solve it. So, going to the next section, I want to raise a bit more the urgency of, again, we talked about where we are, but we want to talk about also what can happen and what can go wrong. So we typically have, if you go to the next slide, we typically started talking to businesses around resiliency. And this is a slightly different concept than security. It basically supplements security, but the resiliency is also about not just about how to make sure things don't go wrong, but also about what happens if things don't go as well as you've planned for it. And typically, things at some point may not go as planned, especially if you don't have a plan in the first place. We talked about having a response plan and whether we can execute that plan. Well, if you don't have a plan, you don't actually even have hope in surviving crisis. But even if you have a plan of you've protected your network, you've educated your employees, you've created a nice response plan, but things may not go as planned. And we start sort of making an analogy of pretty much getting punched in the mouth type scenario. If you go to the next slide, so what happens when you get hit by one of those major things and major incidents? We started calling them security disasters. So it's a bit like having, unfortunately, equivalent of having a fire in your data center or having an earthquake. What do? You install sprinklers. You basically get a secondary data center that's not in the same place. So security disasters have a similar devastating impact. Many years we've ignored them, and we basically talked about that's not plausible. But when they happen, it's called black swan events. First thing you happen is basically a bit of confusion. It's what we call seeing stars. When NotPetya happened 2.5, 3 years ago, betting was actually more of a shock rather than, yes, we've seen this before. And it's not really a first few hours is not very coordinated, and you're trying to understand basically what happened to you rather than what you're going to do about it. And of course, it's relentless. It will happen. It will continue. You can wish it to stop, meaning that you can wish your desktops and servers being encrypted. You can wish it to stop, and it won't stop because we are all very, very connected. So you will get a round and round of this type of relentless attack coming your way. Even if it's not targeted, it could be accidental. And it will be very noisy. The sound and the fury, it will be very noisy, it will be very chaotic. And you will need to have some sound people to deal with the situation, follow a good plan, and it might not be the most inspirational plan. It could be as simple as we got to find our backups and restore our systems in this order. That doesn't sound very inspiring, but it is pretty much the case. I was watching an interview with some of the astronauts who landed on the moon, and you want to hear a great story about inspiration and what they thought about mankind and all that stuff. What they said was pretty much about we were following the procedure, because pretty much they were drilled about that procedure of what things can go wrong and what things can go right. And there's a count. There's a count in terms of how long you can survive in this situation and how long do you have before you start losing your systems. And we've seen it in real life. If you go to the next slide, please. And the countdown is pretty short. In the NotPetya scenario, it took 2 seconds for the first server to get infected and get pretty much disrupted. And it took 7 minutes for the infection to jump, 13 seconds to jump to the next server, and 7 minutes to jump out of the network that it started, and in 90 minutes you lost your IT estate. I had another organization that I was working with. It took them a bit longer, 2 hours, but you could see it jumped from one data center to another, and it was pretty much jumping from one geography to another one, since we have connected ADs and connected networks. So it is a pretty short countdown that you're trying to save your IT and business operations. And the impact, next slide, is quite devastating, right? So you could use all of your servers, you could use all of your laptops, you could use all of your applications. And this not only, obviously, this not only stops your business, but it is a massive recovery operation, right? So if you are working in IT, building servers, building laptops, or if you just call help desk, that it's not really as simple as, well, if you have a Citrix server, maybe, but in other cases, it's not a very easy operation. So that means a lot of manual labor to recover your operations. And this not only impacts your IT, this impacts everything that this IT depends on. If your voice over IP network, phone line is down, if your, digital terminals are down, who are either controlling production or controlling containers, these could be all pretty much stopping your operations. So in some aspects, we've seen that this has caused production to stop, this has caused shipments stop, this has caused issues with the supply chain, and so on and so forth. And we're talking about an attack that wasn't even targeted. Next slide, please. So this, why was the attack effective? Well, we have a culture of cost cutting in IT, and I see why I know where it's coming from. And I recognize this because I've been obviously working on both sides of the fence, working on either auditing IT systems or also helping develop them. So there's a culture of cost cutting which obviously rewards speed, and it rewards obviously financial implications. But obviously that's a very short-term view, and all of us have some technical debt that we need to close, and that will only, unfortunately, in an event like this, work against us. There's definitely rapid digitization. So back in the day when we all have server rooms, everything is sitting in isolation, or your OT environment is isolated from your IT environment. That was all kind of by design. You were secure because you couldn't jump from one network to another one. But in this case, everything is more connected, meaning that the speed and impact will be higher. Flat networks, yes, we have very much connected networks. When we acquire a company, the first thing is to connect their network with our network. Or when we have suppliers, even sometimes they have the networks connected. Segmentation has been a long beast of network security, and we are nowadays in the idea that you either, because it's such an intractable problem when you have hundreds of networks, but we either look at microsegmentation or zero trust type stuff. And privileged access is, of course, very important in terms of people who have the keys to your kingdom. You got to be careful to not to give them to the other side. And recovery, again, it's not just about detection or protection. Recovery was hard because, firstly, you need a lot of people on the ground, and you need actually some people who know how to deal with a crisis situation and organize this within the organization that you have. Next slide, please. So, with all this, now we are seeing security as a credible scenario for business extinction. So security is no longer a protectionist ideal that only purist people are interested. Security is a business impact scenario similar to, planning for a disaster or part of operational resiliency. So we expect security to become more and more featuring in business continuity plans. We expect security to be more described as a in business scenarios rather than just talking about solutions. And we also expect security to be also measured in terms of what's the impact to the business. Because now it is actually part of a business disruption problem rather than an IT security problem. Next. So what can we do about this? So we've heard about the Danish landscape. We've heard about what if scenarios that will actually result in business disruption. So our point of view is to move into a position of resiliency. First, we need to change the mindset. Next slide, please. So we all started from denial. This is maybe 10, 15 years ago, that this is not going to happen. First denial. Second denial, this is not going to happen to me, because you've seen it happen to someone else, but it's not going to happen to me. And the third denial is, this happened once, this will not happen again, right? We can continue like that, of course. I mean, it is a risk that you are taking, but it is still not necessarily a good idea. The previous one. Yeah, just one more. So the next one is pretty much, okay, so this might happen. So why don't we try to protect ourselves? And you try to build walls and protect everything. But we've seen, and even if you're a security purist, that this is not a feasible scenario. So what you need to do is the next one, which is you need to make sure you pick which assets you want to protect most. And some of the assets you need to say, okay, well, I could potentially lose this asset, but as long as I'm able to recover, as long as I'm able to respond to it quickly, that I'm actually okay. For example, I'll give you one example. Your digital operator system, that digital terminals that shows you where your containers are versus your workstation that is, or your server that's running your website, right? So you don't need to have the same level of protection for these two cases. And for one of them, you want to make sure you want to protect it. For the other one, you want to make sure you build it again or you recover from it as soon as possible. So you need a resiliency strategy that is a combination of protect, respond, and recovery. And that takes you to also a more of a zero trust concept, meaning that maybe you don't need to build walls around your perimeter because your perimeter has now disappeared. You need to build trust or protection in very much endpoints of your people, your servers, your workstations, and you also need to look at a scenario of what happens after you get breached, and make sure that you don't forget that part in the expense of only focusing on protection and detection. Next slide, please. I think we've covered enough peer data. We can skip this one. So what we also now looking at is not only before the incidents, when you identify, you build the right organization and you build the right protect measures, but also right after the incident, but also following that incident. So pretty much the thinking has also shifted to make sure that you have a good 30-day plan when you do the crisis management, when you do the business recovery coordination, and then you also have a good forensic and investigation capability. It could be around incident response, but also identifying what went wrong and making sure that you have protect the data if you need to go to court or get a claim for your insurance, but also make sure that you have the right channels to report to the authorities, especially if there's data involved in this. So making sure that not only you focus on identify and protect, but also response. And then after the 30-day response, making sure that you also focus on recovery, which is after the incident. So this is an incident-centric view of security to make sure that you don't forget about response and recovery at the same time. So if I summarize what we can do about it, what I would say is this. You make sure that you cover the security baselines we identified in the first section, that we asked the organizations that, have you got a good response plan? Have you educated your people? Have you fixed your vulnerabilities, legacy or not? And have you got a good defense plan to focus on where you need to focus? Meaning that looking at your threats, know your enemy, know your. So that's number one, is make sure that you get those four things right. Number two is get to a more of a resiliency mindset. So move from only thinking about protecting, but thinking about response and recovery, and making sure that they are also represented based on how you want to approach this to the risk to your organization. What are the threats you're facing, and what are you prepared to do, protect versus recover fast? And thirdly, build this resilience thinking into your business continuity plans. Make this a business language. It's not a security language. Talk about what if scenarios. What if this user clicked this link, which downloaded malware, which affected this critical asset, which is controlling this? And why is this a plausible scenario? Because I didn't educate my users. I don't have any endpoint protection to stop that malware. I have a flat network that can propagate that malware. I have this critical asset, which is legacy with a lot of vulnerabilities, meaning that you then see that this is a plausible scenario and build it into your both security, resiliency strategy and a business continuity plan. Once you've all done all this, make sure that these kind of thinking, it goes into your new technology. When you move to cloud, when you're building a new digital banking solution, or when you're building something that is about handling data, make sure that this thinking that you've established applies to when you're designing and building new solutions as well. So I'll just pause here. Next slide is actually my questions to you, but you can actually already switch to the next slide. But I want to see if there's any questions from the audience before I cover this. Great. Okay. So first question, what does the cyber hygiene procedure cover? Now, this is a good question because we also asked this to ourselves. Maybe our respondents did not really understand the question, or security hygiene might mean anything. Security hygiene for me is basically, first and foremost, you do have a clean environment. I'm not going to, I could take a COVID-19 pretty much situation here, but for me, a clean environment is first and foremost free of vulnerabilities. You might not be able to fix all vulnerabilities, but you got to have a plan, meaning that even if you have legacy vulnerabilities you can't fix, you need to know what you need to do to compensate for that or remediate that. And unfortunately, it is the nature of the game. You can't leave something exploitable. For example, if you can't fix the vulnerability, make sure that they're not exploitable from the outside the network. Things like that, right? Back in the day when I was working on PCI DSS, for credit card data, this was exactly the same concept. If you can't implement a control, make sure you have compensating controls to that. So security hygiene, first and foremost, a clean environment, and you could stop there in terms of security hygiene. But the second part of clean environment is also making sure that the infection doesn't spread as quickly as they can, meaning that your critical assets are in a secure zone. They are pretty much not sitting in your DMZ or your network zone that can be exploited from outside. But for me, that is a next level of thinking already. For me, security hygiene first and foremost starts with vulnerabilities. The next thing about having a clean environment is at least the next level of maturity, if you want to take security hygiene, is to make sure that you pick those assets that are critical to you and you harden security on them. So as I said, this could be some of the most boring assets like your backup servers, so your encryption consoles, or it could be some of your business applications that are sitting on a server, and you make sure that you security harden those servers, and you make sure that you implement security best practices for those servers. And if you want to go to the next level, you make sure you do things like whitelisting or malware protection or credential protection. There are some solutions out there which can really tighten the server that it doesn't become a victim in terms of when things don't go well. The second question on zero trust. Yes, I think zero trust as a concept is first, it's a design principle. First and foremost, it's about moving from the traditional three-tier defense, meaning that you gotta, make sure that you protect your network and you build a three-tier zone in terms of DMZ and application and database zones. It moves the protection to the endpoint, and also it moves the protection to your users. So you don't trust your network, you don't trust your user, you don't trust your application. You make sure that you have controls that are pretty much looking at protecting especially your environments from privileged users, protecting your assets from piece of malware, because you don't necessarily say that this is a part of my network which is pretty much already secure, so I don't need to implement these things on my server, or I can trust these users by default. The second principle is making sure that you don't do that one time only and you do it on a regular basis, and that's also built into the IAM solution that you might be implementing. But that's maybe a topic for another webinar that I would like to come back to. But I think maybe we should create a session for that. Any other questions? Okay, here's a bunch of questions that I can basically leave you with. We will send you these slides, but there is a great list of basically questions that if you are designing or if you are implementing a security strategy, you should ask yourself, but also ask your executives and business sponsors whether these are built into your thinking. And these can go from, you know, these some of these will look fairly um, common sense, but we don't ask these enough. What do we need to protect the most? We basically sometimes say that, oh, I need to segregate my network. Oh, I need to implement privileged access management solution, and then spend millions and millions on them without asking the simple question of what is it actually that I want to protect. Second, for me, that's the most important is what is it that I have that somebody might be interested in? That if that is one thing, that understanding the motivation, that will help you to decide where you want to focus your efforts. And supplier risk is one of the questions. Make sure that you extend these questions to your suppliers and make sure that they also, some of the critical ones like cloud service provider, have the same level of thinking and understanding as you do. So I hope that was useful. That's the end of our session. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and we will distribute some slides from this session. And thank you for listening. Have a great week.